So today's discussion centers on a text that is of crucial importance for the lives that we live. With Hobbes, we have the nexus of the scientific revolution, the fallout from the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of global capital and the modern nation state. So this is really one of the most pivotal readings we'll do this semester. I would invite discussion even from those who may not have been able to get through all of the reading, because a lot of this is working through the logic of the social contract, which is a political idea that Hobbes came up with and is still so essential for modern theorizing about the state. We think about how the nation state is such a fact of our lives. It's the air we breathe, but of course it has a history, and the history is coming into our field of vision in this early modern period. There's much that is illiberal and dehumanizing about the nation state. We can talk about any number of ways this is true, but it has also been a decisive contribution to humanity in providing a space for liberal and humanizing impulses. So I think that contradiction between the possible illiberality of this nation and its making possible many liberalizing things is a kind of paradox we might be able to get a handle on by considering the paradox of Thomas Hobbes. And another big picture to keep item to keep in our minds as we consider these powerful ideas, when we are justly concerned about the question of policing right now, it is only within the polis that is the modern nation state that the police came to be a means for the political sovereign to pacify the inhabitants of a territory. As Weber defined the nation state as a monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force over a large territory. So that internal policing is a very modern thing. And knowing that, it helps us to reimagine policing, as we probably recognize that we must. This paradox of liberal and illiberal has something to do with the fact that Hobbes, even though his formulation seemed very extreme, that we would surrender our power to a sovereign and be at the mercy of the sovereign. In fact, on the one hand, there's a liberal Republican tradition of separation of powers, which he rejects constitutional monarchy, which he doesn't like the idea of a monarch being limited by a constitution. So there's obvious ways in which he's not liberal. But on the other hand, there were people to his right, as it were, however we want to frame this. For instance, Calvin was very strong in insisting on that government, just any governmental authority is by divine right. And that would be an even higher view of state sovereignty than Hobbes has. So he is still trying to moderate between claims here. He was born in 1588, which, as you may recall, is the year of the Spanish Armada's attempt to restore Catholic hegemony in Europe. And he died after a very long life in 1679. In the meantime, so we've already seen in earlier, we began the semester with Luther. So at 1517 was the posting of the 95 Theses. So that immense cry for reform in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church had been the great, one of the great political facts of Europe for basically ever since the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. So there's that factor, and then the religious wars that would continue all the way up through the 30 Years' War, which Hobbes would have been witness to, that horrendous conflagration in the German lands, especially from 1618 to 1648, in which maybe half of the German population was killed. That's a great horror, but more even than that horror of an international war, Hobbes was moved by the horror of civil war. And that is his great problem: how to foreclose the possibility of this most horrendous of things, and that is civil war. Now, in our own country, we're thinking how much has civil friendship broken down as we face this election, and we want to think about what. I think it's extreme to talk about the possibility of civil war, but the fact is, we do need to be alive to the fact that we should cherish whatever institutions we have and whatever habits we have as a people that keep us from doing violence to each other. Before these violent conflicts, so we have another great fact, which is going to be very important for next week's discussion of Spinoza, and that is the emergence of the Dutch Republic. So the first real republic in Europe happened in the late 1500s when they rebelled from the rule of Philip II of Spain, and the Dutch established a very successful commercial republic, and England would take over that role as leading as the leader of commerce, leader in global commerce in the late 1600s. But that rise of global capital is an essential part of the story here. So we have the English Civil War, which was between 1642 and 1651. The background being that with the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, a new royal line came to be, and that was the Stuart line. James I of Scotland took over, and then he was succeeded by Charles I. And the Stuarts were they were minded to be absolute monarchs. So later in this century, in the 1600s, we would see, of course, the great absolute monarch, and that is Louis XIV in France. And so that was one way that the consolidation of the nation state went about, this new monarchy where certain rulers were able to become very powerful and making an alliance with the middle class over the heads of the nobility, and creating a bureaucratic state dependent on their own person. So that was in the background. In England, the English were very resistant to this idea of an absolute monarch. And so this great struggle between Parliament and the kings of England resulted in a civil war between the parliamentarians and the royalists. Eventually, Charles I would be executed, and this was a shocking thing, this regicide, because, of course, there had never been an English monarch that had been executed before. And then, of course, the Civil War. The English Civil War gave us one of the great villains of history, Oliver Cromwell, and I don't just say that as a man of probable Irish background and definite Irish sympathy. He wasn't a good dude. So faced with the Civil War and its horrors, Thomas Hobbes was trying to figure out how to prevent it in the future. And so at the end of the Civil War would emerge this fascinating book, Leviathan, a book that, even though most people have hated its conclusions, we have all found it to be inevitable as a work of political science. So he's basically asking the question of justice, as any political philosopher is asking, and what would make a regime just? And in fact, he presents this kind of liberalism where you have a procedural understanding of what is just. And he comes up with this thought experiment, the social contract, based in the prior thought for the social contract is that we are in a state of nature, that we have to think about the conditions for the polity that we would agree to. If we were, and on his view, the most important right, the basic right, is the right to preserve our own existence. That is the horizon of his thought. Would we sign over our right? So what would make a regime just? Would we sign over our right to everything, which is what he says, in the state of nature, we have the right to everything that augments our lives because we have the power, we have an equality of power to do that. So would we sign over that right to everything? Because when I have that right to everything, everybody else has that right to everything, and then we get what he calls the war of all against all in this situation. So Would we surrender that, each of us contracting with each other? Would we say, well, okay, I'll give up my right to seize everything I can, and you give your right to seize everything you can, and we'll give that right to the sovereign. And if we do that, though, we can't check that sovereign. That sovereign now has the right to everything, but the deal is that the sovereign will then make sure that we don't kill each other in a war of all against all. So it's not a question of virtue. Justice is not a question of virtue. It's a question of what will, in fact, preserve us from the fear that my neighbor will kill me for what I've got or to make use of me. So the social contract theory has been decisive in how modern political thinkers think the political realm. And Locke obviously gives a very, very moderated version of this, and Rousseau gives a very strange version of this. And we'll have occasion to think about Rousseau's. In that great and celebrated phrase, Hobbes describes the state of nature as a condition in which life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And I think about what might be apt as a comparison is if you think about some post-apocalyptic literature, maybe The Road by Cormac McCarthy or something like that, where scarcity becomes very present. And then you think about how some people will just take what they can. And that's a state of, that would definitely be a state of nature. So to get out of that state, we would contract with each other, and here we are, though, there's no selflessness involved. I am, by my reason, an egoist. I make calculations of self-interest, and you're making calculations of self-interest, and we come to a social contract. We invest sovereignty in a certain government. That government should not be limited in any way within itself by separation of powers or outside itself by constitution. He comes up with this theory based on a very tight set of coordinates. He is one of the advancers of the scientific revolution. He wants a science of politics, and indeed, he really provides us a sociology, which really doesn't come into its own until the 19th century. But here, he's giving us the beginnings of one. He's a strict materialist. So there is something new about this man's thought. He's a strict materialist. He's a determinist. And he is a relativist. That is, not by using that term in a loose sense. He says what is good is what I have an appetite for, and what is evil is what I recoil from. And we transfer the standard of right of good and evil to the sovereign when we make the social contract. So whatever the sovereign finds appetizing is good. Whatever the sovereign doesn't like is evil, and we all live by that. The psychology of Hobbes is based on a materialist view that all our ideas come through the senses, certainly, but they really are just images, and they're ways of rearranging images of those sensations. Our reason is not, it's a higher faculty, it's an instrumental faculty that serves our passions. And he rejects Aristotelian scholasticism as really nonsense. Voluntary action for Hobbes, by definition, is only the pursuit of what seems good to my appetite. So actually, you can get from there to how he's actually still being a determinist when he talks about voluntary action. He holds to a mechanistic materialism. Really, he believes that humans are not rational animals, as Aristotle holds, but humans are rational machines. From this physiology and psychology, he derives, according to a geometric method of definitions and deductions, which we've got a taste of in this reading before us, he derives a social and political science. Like Machiavelli, this is a political theory that is a science of power. He does maintain that we are personated in the sovereign of this political community, which he calls Leviathan, right? This is a secularized ecclesiology where we all become members. We have our personality really in this great beast. And so one might say that here we have a politics that does close the horizon. It secularizes our political life. And we ask ourselves, what role then do religious reasons play in the public square, or could they play? What does liberal republicanism make sense presented with this challenge that Hobbes gives us? And then again, think of our own time, and how precarious things are when civic friendship collapses. What is the Hobbesian anthropology's view of humanity? Is that a way that gives us any hope for a better tomorrow in terms of our own nation state? The questions that I think might be useful for us to talk about. Number one, on a Hobbesian reading, human dignity is not intrinsic. Is his understanding of the worth of a human tough-minded truth-telling? Is he telling it like it is? Or does Hobbes not well describe how we actually distribute honor and status, individually, socially, politically? Number two, Hobbes maintains the natural equality of humans. What does he mean when he claims this? Is this what we mean by human equality? Number three, Aristotle claims that humans are by nature social. Hobbes insists that the state of nature is a condition of war of all against all. What has Hobbes assumed in his profile of quote unquote men? That is, what does the modern bourgeois subject look like? And number four, does the reduction of right and rights to the liberty to employ one's power to preserve one's life yield an ethics resembling that which governs us in our daily lives? Is this the way we actually live? Does it yield a humane politics?